You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJ IMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. What was Young Bengal and why does it matter? I'm joined by Rosinka Chaudhary, the leading expert on the subject and the author of India's First Radicals. In this book, Chaudhary explains how Young Bengal, the first generation of students to graduate from Calcutta's Hindu College in the late 1820s and early 1830s, ushered in dramatic changes which still have reverberations today. Members of Young Bengal were fearlessly reformist and secular, championing free speech, liberty, and equality. Later generations accused them of everything from overt westernization to drunkenness. But Chaudhary rescues the generation from these stereotypes, seeing in them the very foundations of modern Indian society and its politics. Thank you, Rosinka, for joining us today. The first question I'd like to ask you is a rather straightforward one. What precisely was Young Bengal? Why does it matter?
Thank you, Dinyar. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure. You've started with a question that will certainly help people understand who and what precisely we're talking about. Because even for historians or the common reader as well in this part of the country who know they know the nomenclature certainly Young Bengal, but thing is that it came to mean almost anything and everything. Young Bengal began to be a term that was used for anybody who wrote and spoke in English, who drank too much, who had annoying political opinions, who were reformers. It just came to signify too many things. Over the course of the 19th century, from when it began to first be used in the 1840s, right down to the end of the century, it came to mean too many things, which is why I myself have had to define exactly what I mean by Young Bengal at the start of the book itself. And I've said there that I'm not going to be looking at every manifestation of the word as it occurred in the print media in over the course of the 19th century in Bengal. I am looking very specifically at a group of friends who were active in the 1830s and 1840s, and at their attempt at social and political reform or some sort of change. I hesitate to use the word reform because it has come to mean specific things in our history books. But certainly, these are men who were arguing for change, and these were also men arguing against the current state of affairs as we saw them here in the country, tightening my focus to a very small group who nevertheless did a lot of work I thought would help me define what I at least mean by Young Bengal. Many people think of it in different ways. This is the way in which I think of Young Bengal. And the attendant corollary question was why it matters. I think it matters. I may be one of the very few people who think it matters because historians have traditionally tended to ignore it. They have tended to say, in fact, if you said to them that, okay, I'm thinking of researching this period, the 1830s and the 1840s, to look at this particular group of men who were later called Young Bengal, the standard response would have been, and was in fact, why? Nothing happened. To which my rather incredulous response has been 2 entire decades in the history of modern India. Can it really be that nothing happened in that period? Obviously, something happened. Why has nobody written about what has happened in these decades? Was the question I wanted to ask myself in this book. So it matters because mostly it is filling a gap in history writing. That mattered to me, certainly. And the other reason that it matters is because the struggle that these men undertook against a colonial regime, while recognizing that they were living under a despotism, under East India Company rule, the struggle they undertook for the basic rights of freedom, of equality, of better conditions for the Indian people, these struggles are still with us today. I don't think it is these struggles are over just because we are now an independent country and have been so since 1947. These struggles don't stop with historical marker like independence. They need to be fought for again and again whenever we are faced with a situation where we are faced with a loss of liberty, a loss of rights, a loss of a feeling of all Indians being equal. Whenever we are faced with such a situation, such a premise, such a feeling, we need to then fight again for those rights. So I thought that this group mattered because they were the first modern Indians, as I call them, to fight for certain rights in the civil and political sphere divorced from religion. So when I say they were India's first radicals, I don't mean that the Bhakti poets were not radicals or that there were no radicals in whatever century BC. I'm sure there were. But all those histories of radicalism are linked in some form or the other to the devotional field. Whereas this group is the first group, I think, at least, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, who are thinking of themselves as modern Indians and fighting for rights in the civil and political and social sphere and insisting that be separated from the religious sphere. They said repeatedly, we do not want to have anything to do with religion. So, in that, they're quite unique and they set forth an idea of secular India that I think persists to this day. That's why they matter.
Thank you. So I found your book particularly useful in that regard, in terms of defining who precisely Young Bengal was. In the sense that myself, as a historian primarily of Bombay during the colonial period, I would have heard of Young Bengal. It certainly was talked a lot in Bombay from the 1830s and 1840s onwards, but I always thought of Young Bengal as being a rather umbrella term used to describe a group of reformers emerging out of Hindu College or other places in Calcutta from the 1820s onward. And you mentioned in your book that no, this actually refers to a small group of people. You mentioned in your book Tarachand Chakraborty, Krishna Mohan Banerjee, Ram Gopal Ghosh, Rasik Krishna Malek, Dakshina Ranjan Mukherjee, Radhanath Sikdar, and Pyari Chand Mitra. I think those are the principal members you cover, right? In your book.
Yes, correct. Exactly.
And you mentioned furthermore that these individuals, you do not categorize them as liberals. Now, many historians have talked about this period in general as being one of liberalism, and people have used people like Ram Mohan Roy as the prime example, and then have talked about the associational activity that you see in all the three presidency cities from the 1850s onwards, where many members of both the mercantile elite and the educated classes in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras get together and they form political associations. But you disagree, and you say that they're not liberal. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about why you disagree that Young Bengal was not liberal, and how is it different in that regard from, say, the politics that was being invoked by people like Ram Mohan?
So I'll answer that in two sections. I'll deal with how they were different from Ram Mohan Roy first, and then I'll say why I've said they're not liberal. Ram Mohan Roy is someone who we read of in our history textbooks as the father of modern India. This is someone who has been canonized and whose work we know of. We know exactly what he fought for and how. He has also been critiqued in Bengal, and the whole idea of the Bengal Renaissance has been dismantled by the subaltern studies historians. So there has been healthy argumentation, debate, and discussion around the figure of Roy. It is Chris Bailey, of course, who thinks of him as India's first liberal. He, in his book Recovering Liberties, he of course starts with Ram Mohan. The point that I make in this book is that by the time Young Bengal is fighting on various fronts, there has been a shift in gear. They are not 18th century gentlemen. Roy himself was. They argue on the basis of certain beliefs that certainly Ram Mohan Roy would have shared some of them, but their methods of political activism have moved forward to encompass the utilization of public opinion, because now they begin to think that petitions are no use. Public shifting or a shifting of public opinion is the only thing that will shift Parliament, and it is only if the British Parliament can be moved, that the East India Company role might be displaced or at least transformed in some aspects. So their methods and their ideas differ from Ram Mohan's. There's also a very interesting episode with Radhanath Sikdar, which you would have read, where I've shown how similar instances of facing abuse from a British magistrate in a Mufasil area in Bengal. Ram Mohan writes a letter to Lord Mayo demanding redressal as a gentleman himself of some distinction. Slaps a case, I think the first case in modern India, against a British magistrate for the abuse of coolies in the employ of the survey. He argues there for the equal rights of those men, and his rhetoric throughout is one of the equality of man, that he is a man, as are the coolies, as is the magistrate, and that there is a certain equality promised to the British subject. And of course, all these three categories would have been recognized by him as just simply being British subjects, which he is willing to fight for. So there has been a fundamental shift then in the manner in which this group is beginning to think of themselves, to think of the nation, and to think of their rights. That is with regard to the question of how they were different from Ram, which then leads us to the question of why I choose not to call them liberals. I thought that the term liberalism, as it's used by political scientists and historians throughout the world, is premised on certain categories and a certain understanding. Writers, liberal writers, that came a little later than this group. So, what was this group reading? They were reading Tom Paine's Rights of Man. I mentioned how, and this is a very famous anecdote of how they bought it for at 5 times the price from an American bookseller who had shipped a whole shipload, sorry, of Tom Paine's Rights of books to Calcutta. And Rights of Man was selling at 5 times its price because the Hindu college students were buying them at 5 times the price. So they had read Hume and they had read Locke, they had read Hobbes, they had read a lot of Milton and were great admirers of Milton. But, and although one of their cohort, Kashif Prasad Ghosh, wrote a review of Mill's History of British India, disagreeing with Mill's argument there, the classic liberalism, as we understand it from James Mill and especially in John Stuart Mill, comes later. My argument in the book actually is that, in fact, in their activities and their thoughts, they enact some of the ideas that John Stuart Mill would then put forth in his arguments, in his books on liberty or on representative government. Although, of course, we know famously J.S. Mill did not think Indians were fit for government. Young Bengal certainly thought they were. As since you've read the book, Dakina Ranjan actually asked for representative government later on in his life in the 1870s. That's the reason, really. I thought to call them liberals or espousing liberalism in the sense in which it is understood classically in political philosophy or in history would be anachronistic. That's why I didn't want to use the term.
I want to circle back to something you had mentioned in response to my first question, which was this idea of young Bengal as being oftentimes branded as an irritating set of people who are drunk caricature of young Bengal that is offered in one Calcutta magazine, as members were described as, quote, cutting their way through ham and beef and wading to liberalism through tumblers of beer. How is this assessment off the mark and at the same time so influential when it comes to stereotypes of this generation?
That I was sorry to have interrupted you. I was going to say that that particular quote has been used and reused many times over, everywhere, all the time. They were, of course, there is no question that they were stereotyped. There were many defenses of young Bengal at this time as well. So Shashi Chandra Dutt, who himself is a few years younger to this group, actually mentions this canard of the drink, too much drink, and says that he would like to himself be identified as someone who could be called young Bengal, that definition meant someone who was hard reading rather than hard drinking. So in these defenses of young Bengal, people pointed out again and again that this was a group that was incredibly widely read, but the caricatures persisted, not just widely read, but men of action. This is what I've tried to show in the book, exactly what they did rather than what they simply read or said. This is what the book is retrieving from the archive for the first time, I think. Though there may be scattered references, I'm not sure. But certainly no one has actually gone into the archive and put forward their activity in this way, in this way before. So yes, these stereotypes were there and they persist, not just hard drinking, but also Atheism was the other thing, that these people don't believe in God. Now, you could say, for instance, in response, that no, these are men who don't believe in caste. For instance, Ramtanu Lahiri, the youngest member of the group, who I, in fact, have not managed to write very much about because the book concentrates on 1843. But Ramtanu Lahiri actually cut off his Brahminical sacred thread with a scissor and threw it away. Now, and he did this publicly, obviously. So it is a matter of record. So now, how many Brahmins cutting off their sacred thread and throwing it away in 1851? How was this even an act that had any, forget about precedence, but did it have any emulation? Did anybody else ever do this? There may have been, but certainly these were people who acted according to their principle. Now, that sort of activity also, of course, enraged not just the Orthodox, it enraged ordinary middle class, if I can call it that, sensibility. Just the ordinary Bengali would have been completely aghast at such action. So the canard spread that these are people who don't believe in God, they're atheists. They were not. As again, in another piece of archival retrieval that has not been seen before, I found out that a famous instance that's also often cited with the ham and beef one. These are people who, when asked to swear upon the Gita in court, refused to do. Now, this turned out to be Rishi Krishna Mullik, who, in fact, refused to swear by the Hindu sacred text that he had been handed in court. But I found his vindication of it in a newspaper. And he is very moral in his reasons for refusal. He says that he was given a sacred text, proffered to him by a Brahmin to sign, to swear by in court, and that he was not going to swear by anything he did not understand, as he had not learned Sanskrit and he did not know Sanskrit and he did not understand what the Sanskrit, had no knowledge of what the Sanskrit text he was being asked to swear by was. He was not going to swear by it. But that didn't believe that he was not a believer in God. He affirms there in that letter, he is very much a believer in the one God. And he's identifying himself as a monotheist over there, probably aligned with Ramon's Brahmo Samaj. I'm not sure if he was actually formally a member. There is the reality that I'm mentioning, and there is the stereotype that then proliferates across print publication at the time.
So, in your book, we get a sense of the towering influence of one particular individual on young Bengal. And that, of course, is Henry Louis Vivian de Rosio, the instructor at Hindu College at the time, who died when he was only 22. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about De Rosio and Hindu College at the time. You, of course, have edited a volume earlier which looked at De Rosio. For those listeners who might not know much about that particular individual or his influence, can you enlighten us a bit on what his viewpoints were, how he educated the students, and how precisely the students responded to the ideas and viewpoints that De Rosio brought to the classroom?
Sure. So De Rosio was appointed to the Hindu College in 1826 as a very young man. In fact, he was, I think, only 17 or 18 himself when he was appointed to the post. We must remember that this first batch of the Hindu College, these students, the ones I discuss in the book, they were themselves barely a few years younger than him. So they would have been 14, 15 when he was 17, 18. By the time they graduate, he has already been forced to resign from the Hindu College in 1831. And he, in fact, dies very soon after. He is a great influence on them because of his teachings, yes, because of his classes in certainly the sort of readings that were prescribed not so much individually by De Rosio, but in fact also by H. Wilson, who was the one who had changed the kind of education that these students were getting when he was appointed to his post at the Hindu College. And he begins to import books from London for the library at the Hindu College for the students to read and be taught those books. So that is not a change that can be attributed to De Rosio alone. But certainly, yes, De Rosio was a friend to this group of men. They learned more outside of class than in it, most probably. So while the Hindu College was important, De Rosio was more important to them also because of the activities they indulged in outside of class. There is something called the Academic Association, which all historians of Bengal know about, which was formed by De Rosio and David Hare and these students in 1828, where they discussed the philosophy texts that they were reading outside of their curriculum. that proved so popular, in fact, that at one point there were almost 400 young men who were gathering together to read in this reading group, almost one can call it, outside of college hours. So there was a certain level of intense debate, discussion, and reading and talk around the ideas that around the books that they were reading that Derozio was responsible for, Hare, David Hare himself also responsible for. That was happening in a very intense way for them. In that sense, Derozio is important. In that sense, the Hindu College is important. But we must remember that, as you mentioned, Derozio dies at the age of 22, very young, leaving these students to then carve their own way. So, in the following decade, and I'm looking at the year 1843 when they are men of action, not just rebels, iconoclasts, people who are shocking and scandalizing society by throwing beef into neighboring Brahmins' houses or such like. They have outgrown those adolescent activities, which happened in that year in 1831. And then they are carving their own way independently of Derozio and becoming professionals, writers, teachers, various kinds of occupation. None of them were actually landholders or wealthy in that sense, in which there were many as really wealthy men in colonial Calcutta at the time. They were not, they didn't belong to that set, certainly. Some of them may have been better off than others, but a number of them were scholarship students, people whose parents didn't have enough money to put them in Hindu college, but there were a lot of scholarships offered in the first years, and Shikdar was a scholarship student, so was Ram Gopal Ghosh. These were students who were given their places in the Hindu college because of their merit. So, in that sense, Hindu college is an enabler. But yes, so Derozio and the Hindu college is important. But for my book, actually, it forms a sort of background rather than I try to foreground what happens a decade later.
One thing I'm struck about in the story that you present about young Bengal is how similar it is in many ways to what happens in Bombay about maybe 15, 20 years later, in the sense that you do have in Elphinstone College here in Bombay a group of students who gather around one or two very charismatic individuals. So whereas in Calcutta, of course, it was Derozio and Hare and others, in Bombay, you have people like Bal Gangadhar Jambekar, who dies also tragically young at the age of 35. You have a few very influential Scottish and Irish professors also who mentor this group, and this group forms academic associations as well. They don't go around throwing beefsteaks in people's houses. They don't go around offending the religious sensibilities of their elders. But there are many other ways that they are quite similar. They're reading many of the same people. They're reading Paine. They're reading Locke. They are very interested in figures from the Scottish Enlightenment. They pick up on a variety of liberal arts topics. They excel in the sciences also. Many of the people from this generation go on to become prominent mathematicians or become professors of medicine and such. So I see so many similarities. And of course, in Bombay, people were observing what was going on in Bengal and commenting on how this generation develops. But I think the one really big important difference, again, is that you really identify that the young Bengal generation, first of all, the public display of their reforming streak caused a lot of shock, especially to the parents of these students. And you talk in particular about a particular phenomenon that goes on with these students in the sense that they were in danger as long as they remained in Hindu college and specifically under the instruction of Derozio. What type of personal risks did these students take by staying on and continuing down this reformist path?
Dinyar, in fact, it's been with some pleasure that I've learned about this group at Elphinstone from you, in fact, because I was not aware of this. This is another problem in this period, in that, or problem, sorry, not in the period, a problem with us, with those of us who are looking at this period, in that we tend to work in silos. We don't really, it is also not possible humanly. Of course, it's difficult enough to excavate the archive for one region, but to actually manage to do that and make the connections across regions is very difficult. Maybe it will happen in the future. So it was with pleasure that I came to know from you about what you're calling Young Bombay and the group in Elphinstone. And I'm not surprised that these were Irish and Scottish professors at all, because the Scots, particularly, of course, have a great deal of influence on young Bengal. The Scottish common sense philosophers are important to them. It's not just that they're reading Reid and Stewart and Brown, they are also being taught. Derozio himself is being taught by a man called David Drummond, who establishes a private school called Drummond's Academy, in which all students, regardless of color, whether you were mixed race or English or Scottish or Bengali, all races studied together. That moment vanished very quickly later on in the 19th century. But the Scottish Enlightenment has a considerable impact. What you say about mathematics also is very interesting because, as Shikdar, of course, Radhanath Shikdar, being a mathematical genius and described as such by George Everest, who employs him in the trigonometrical survey. And there is a chapter, again, where I've put down the story of how he was the chief computer in charge of the calculation of the height of Mount Everest, for which, of course, he was not given any credit at the time or later. So yes, science was important. The youth of this group is important, and it's interesting to see that yes, so many of to see that you mentioned another teacher there in Elphinstone who died young at the age of 35. So there are correspondences, obviously, but yes, the level of extremes that this group went to, the shock and horror that they inspired in their parents and their parents' generation was unprecedented. I didn't have any, I don't think, equivalent in Indian history in the 19th century. There were considerable personal risks. The last thing you asked was about personal risk. Again, as I've mentioned in the book, these were men who were actually drugged, abducted, taken away by their own families in order to bring them back to the fold, to bring them back to the family, to Hindu society. Krishnamohan Bandopadhyay writes the first Indian play in English, The Persecuted, in 1831. If you read it, you will have a vivid sense of what he went through himself and the manner in which he stuck to his own beliefs, because you have the father in that play arguing for the son to simply enact the ritual of penance. Just do the ritual, and it doesn't matter what you do in your private life. You can just go on drinking or eating meat or whatever it is you're doing. But for society, just do this, perform this particular ritual of penance, and you will be readmitted into Hindu society, which is what used to be done in such cases. And the character in the play, as well as Krishnamohan Bandopadhyay in real life, refusing to do, saying that, no, I believe in my principles, I believe in the morality of my principles, and I will not lie in order to be accepted back into Hindu society. And I would rather face the consequences. And they did face the consequences. So Krishnamohan was thrown out of his house by his father. He refused to apologize or to enact the penance. Roshi Krishna Mullik himself, Dakshinaranjan, was abducted, drugged. He was taken away, put on a boat to Benares. But none of this actually in the end worked, because these men withstood it all, came back from it. Dakshinaranjan apparently was seriously ill for some time after this incident, but they survived it and they insisted on sticking to their principles and doing what they felt was the right thing. Yes, considerable personal risk, which is actually quite unbelievable, incredible if we think about it in contemporary terms. If anybody told us something like that was happening to a student today, it just defies belief that such things could be done to a young man of their own family in order to preserve honor or respect or whatever it is. But these things are done. We know that these things persist sometimes, in fact, in our society. So yes, they did face considerable personal risk, but they withstood it and they stood by their principles.
From risk, I want to move on to reform. And you talk about how members of Young Bengal were the first to construct the idea of the people of India, defining the people as a political category and as an active agent of change. To what degree was Young Bengal aware of movements elsewhere in the world that were making similar arguments? For example, Mazzini's Young Italy or Chartism in Great Britain. And how did they conceive of the Indian people alongside other emergent nationalities, whether it was the Italians or the Greeks?
Young Italy is, again, this group, because they are leaving the Hindu College in 1831 and I'm tracing the years up to 1843, focusing specifically on that year. Young Italy comes a little later. So they, in fact, begin to be called Young Bengal because the press in the country see the correspondences with Young Italy and Young Ireland, and they then begin to refer to this group retrospectively as Young Bengal. So, in that sense, that is why they are called Young Bengal at all, because of Young Italy. But Young Italy doesn't come, they precede Dini. What they are influenced by is Chartism. Now, this I have written about in some detail in the book, because what they do, actually, very interestingly, is they write to a very famous celebrity abolitionist, an abolitionist who has become a celebrity by this time, a man called George Thompson. And they invite him to India. And because he came on Darkwanath Tagore's ship, it has been universally said that Darkwanath Tagore brought George Thompson to India, which is true literally in that he did bring him to India on his ship. But I have looked at letters and speeches by George Thompson where he is specifically saying that he has been invited to Calcutta by a group of native inhabitants, as he calls them, in order to speak with them on the situation in India. And George Thompson, as we know, after he spends a year in India in 1843, goes back to Britain and stands on a Chartist ticket from Tower Hamlets in East London and wins a seat in the British Parliament on a, if not on a Chartist ticket, but certainly on a ticket that was allied with the Chartists. So, Chartism, they would have had a very good idea of front and personally from George Thompson while he was in Calcutta in 1843, because they interacted with him while he was here almost on a daily basis. So that is something they were well aware of. Now, through all these discussions, so arriving at conception, but again, I want to make it very clear that it is not influence and impact. This category of influence and impact, which has bedeviled all of our thinking about the colonial period, that there was colonial influence and then there was the impact on the Indians, really needs to be dismantled now with some degree of heavy handedness. And we can see that Ram Gopal Ghosh, 2 or 3 years before Thompson is coming to India, is charting out a plan of how to move public opinion in Britain so that Parliament will take note and Parliament will then move in order to act on behalf of the people of India. So, this is before Thompson even arrives. This is the reason they are inviting Thompson. Once Thompson arrives, yes, they talk to him and they form the first Indian political party, as I've said, and they embark on this. These are the very nascent stages of what would be a very long journey, as we know. Regarding the category the people of India, it's a perfectly simple argument. I've argued that such a concept exists in language and in culture before it exists in the political sphere. So, when we think of a phrase such as the people of India, we need to first see how it is even being thought of by Indians at the time that they first begin to use such a phrase. When do Indians first begin to say people of India? And they are saying it in the English language first, of course, and then in the Indian languages. This is something I'm familiar with from my work in the poetry, because I know that it is in English poetry written by Indians, the first being Derozio, where the Indian nation is first being sung into existence. To India, my native land, the harp of India. These are now required reading in school textbooks, or they were certainly in my day. But these are written in the English language and they are happening before the Bengali, Hindi, Malayalam, Gujarati is happening in the second half of the 19th century. So I knew that already from my work in the literary sphere. So it came as no surprise to me to see when I looked at it that in the Bengali, at the same time as these people are writing the people of India in the Bengal Spectator, that is Young Bengal, this is a Young Bengal paper, the Bengal Spectator. They're writing the people of India. At the same time, best known Bengali editor of the most widely read Bengali newspaper, the Shangbad Prabhakar, is using the word pruja, which means subject. He is not using the equivalent of the people of India at all. That will come later. By the 1850s, 1860s, slowly then we begin to see words such as in Bangla, Jonogon being used of the people to refer to the people as we understand what we mean by the people today. It will happen later, but it is happening first in the English language. And I'm not ashamed to say that, as nationalist historians have been ashamed of this fact. I think we should get over this feeling of something that is first articulated by Indians in the English language somehow not being authentic enough. This bogey of authenticity also needs to be dismantled. And we need to recognize that whichever language it is spoken in, these are concepts, and these concepts are, we just need to look at when these concepts are first being argued for and imagined by Indians themselves, regardless of in which language. That is an argument also that needs to be now made more forcefully than it has been in the past.
I agree entirely. And it's important to remember also that at this time, English is not only a bridge language between different Indians talking in different parts of the country, but also a bridge language between Indians and the Britons who are working with them in order to cooperate on various political projects. You mentioned George Thompson, and obviously he's perhaps the most famous individual in this era who's working with Indians. But as we both know, there's so many more allies and people who are working on the sides, who are supporting Indian political rights all over the country. So it's really language in this sense is of secondary importance, right? And also we have to remember that various languages are in their development. I mean, if you look at Gujarati at this stage,
Right.
two people writing in Gujarati are writing in completely different ways, right? Different spellings, idiomatics, and everything. So
Correct.
it's no surprise in many ways that these terms still first come into use in English and only later go into the vernacular. So in addition to this idea of the people, you talk about many other landmark moments, and we don't have enough time to talk about all of the firsts that Young Bengal does, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about the institutions that individuals in this generation formed. They found a number of important newspapers, they found schools, and not just schools for men, but schools for women also. But they also found an organization called the Bengal British Indian Society with George Thompson, which you describe in your book as being the first political party in India. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this organization.
Sure. Let me start with the Bengal British India Society. You remember I spoke about Ram Gopal Ghosh and William Adam formulating a plan to move public opinion in Britain. So William Adam then travels Boston first and then relocates to London. And in London, he joins the British India Society, which has been formed in 1839 by Chartists, Quakers, dissenters, a very interesting group of free-thinking people in Britain at the time. And he begins to publish a paper called the British Indian Advocate, and they are trying to do what they can to make some change possible in Britain itself. But they are unable to speak forcefully unless they say, and this is the part that Young Bengal has devised, unless they say that this is what Indians themselves are saying, which is where then Ram Gopal Ghosh sees the importance of the fact that Indians themselves must gather this information. Indians themselves must make the argument. Indians themselves must send this information about what is the situation like in the Mufassirs? What is the condition of the people of India, the people of the soil? Are they better off or worse off than before? He has a whole list of questions that he has. And he wants to collect information about these questions by fanning out. He actually asks all these Hindu college batchmates of his, not this particular, apart from that, the wider, the penumbra, so to speak, the larger group around the smaller group, many of whom are then also working as deputy district collectors or whatever in the districts, to collect this information and send the information to us. And then once they have this information, they will relay it, and that will bring about some change. So that is the whole impetus behind trying to move public opinion. But once George Thompson arrives in 1843, then they decide, and in fact, the whole stimulus is when the principal of the Hindu college, D.N. Richardson, stands up in the Sanskrit College hall where they were holding their meeting and accuses Dakshinaranjan of converting the college premises into a den of treason. And he says, oh, the government has given you this education and you're speaking against the government. How dare you? Is the sort of thing he says. And instead of, as I've shown in that chapter, instead of the college authorities closing down the meeting or the police being called or any such consequence, Sajjad Chakraborty, who is the chair of that meeting, stands up and asks D.L. Richardson to leave the premises instead. Now, that is how the incident ended that day. But then they decided that we're not going to have our meetings in these government premises anymore. And that is when they decide to move premises, as well as that is when they finally decide to set up their own political party, which is the Bengal British India Society. They want to ally with the British India Society because they think that is going to be the most effective way in which to effect political change. So they formed the Bengal British India Society in 1843. George Thompson is appointed its first president. It's an honorary role. Actually, they are the main office bearers. And in its resolutions, which also I've retrieved for the first time from the archive at the British Library, it doesn't seem to be any very much different from the Indian National Congress, which was set up in 1885, again with and through the mediation of Hume, A.O. Hume. So this was interesting to me that they are putting in place a method of constitutional agitation, constitutional reform, an argument for constitutional reform, which will then be followed by Nauroji, that will then be followed by Surendranath Banerjee, that will then be followed by every single leader of the 19th century who wants to act on behalf of the people of India. So I thought it merited being called the first Indian political party. It's been ignored, maybe also because people thought, oh, George Thompson came and he made this party, and oh, these people were just, who were they after all? It was just impact and influence, which is not true if you look at all the evidence. Yeah, and also perhaps because it was short-lived, very short-lived. They ran out of funding once I think Darukanath Tagore supplied quite a bit of funding to the party. And once he died in 1846, the party ceased to exist. 3 years is hardly anything at all, a mere blip, of course, in the history of sort of Indian political parties and their formation in 19th century India. But a significant blip, I think, in that it puts in place a certain way of arguing for political rights that was not there before. It is a party in that sense. They are thinking of themselves also in pan-Indian terms. There is, I think, also a Bombay British India Society, if I'm not mistaken.
Even more briefly lived. You're correct. I think barely met, if anything. I've been able to find hardly any evidence of it.
Right.
So in comparison, the Bengal version lived for a very long time in comparison.
Yeah, in comparison, yes. But yes, so maybe these are the reasons why this society has not been considered important, but I think they are, and I've made the argument that they are. You asked also about other kinds of institutions. Newspapers, of course, I've already said they ran. In fact, the first newspaper they set up was called the Gyan Anveshan, Gyan Anneshon, pronounced in Bengali, which they set up in 1831. It was actually first set up as a Bengali newspaper. And it was only 2 or 3 years later when they realized that no, if they wanted reform, they needed the British ruling classes to also see what they were arguing for, that they then turned it into a bilingual newspaper, and then it becomes both Bengali and English. It came out in parallel columns of Bengali and English. The Bengal Spectator, which they founded in 1843, similarly also parallel columns of Bengali and English. So very important newspapers for this period. They were primarily responsible for these newspapers. Krishnamohan Bandyopadhyay and again members of this group, they ran something else called the Inquirer in 1831 alongside the Gyan Anneshon. So there are a number of papers. Papers were very important. Papers were the social media of the time. So if they needed anything to get their ideas out there, they needed print publications. And so they invested hugely whatever money they had in setting up newspapers. Again, similarly, schools. A large number of them went on to be teachers. They went on to set up schools. They understood the importance of education in a way that is unparalleled. I think for the history of India, and I think this would be true for Bombay as well, the manner in which Indians realized how important a good education was, I think we have forgotten it now. I don't think anybody invested in education more than 19th century wealthy Indians did. Wealthy Indians today spend money on centers of research and scholarship at Harvard and Columbia. They give money to Harvard and Columbia, but they don't give money to their own country and their own institutions here. And until don't do that, there will be no equivalent progress. This is something that thankfully the wealthy elite of the 19th century didn't give their money to Harvard or Columbia or anywhere else in America. They gave it to their own educational institutes, which is why we managed to produce generations of Indians educated at a level on par with the rest of the world. Sorry for that aside, short aside. But yeah,
No, it's completely understandable. And I think you see a lot of competition also between different parts of India for who can be the most philanthropic towards donating to educational institutions.
exactly.
I know there was a lot of competition between Calcutta and Bombay in that department.
Exactly. And where would have we have been without that? These institutions were with Indian money. People think of them as anglicized institutions. Oh, Elphinstone was set up by Elphinstone. No, I'm sorry, it was set up by Indian money. At least the Hindu college was completely financed with Indian money. And in fact, in the face of some reluctance from the British themselves, Indians invested in their own education. They, unlike the current generation, they didn't give their money to Harvard and Columbia and other elite Ivy League schools in America who don't need the money in any case. They gave it to other Indians, and that is why they set up these wonderful institutions. And yes, you're right. Of course, for young Bengal, very importantly, also they gave money for female education. Dokinaranjan gave his land, he gave money, so much of it that when Bethune, who set up the first school for girls in Calcutta, what is now known as Bethune College, he insisted in his will that Dokinaranjan be recognized for his donations and his work and his activity on behalf of women's education in Bengal. So, yes, they set up institutions and they set up India's first political party.
The last question I want to ask you is that regards the legacy of Young Bengal. And so again, here we're circling back to the beginning of our talk when you mentioned about how Young Bengal was derided and spoke about it with derisory language by later generations. So that takes place by the second half of the 19th century. And you bring up in your book how even people like Bankim Chandra, for example, wrote in a very satirical manner against Young Bengal. But not only was Young Bengal mocked, it was also in many ways forgotten. There's a huge gap in the scholarship that extends from Rammohun Roy up into the 1850s, and that gap is where Young Bengal really starts and flourishes, and it's important, and yet scholars have neglected it as well as it's been erased in popular memory. So why do you think, first of all, that this fate of Young Bengal has been derision, and second of all, has also been erasure?
This was a question that interested me greatly. Now, one thing you must remember, Dinyar, is that I'm not a historian. I was not trained in history writing. I am a student of literature. And although I have very illustrious antecedents in men like Sir Jadunath Sarkar, who taught English literature, not only studied English literature, but taught it in the first part of their career and went on to become historians. I'm not comparing myself to such a historian. I'm just mentioning it as something that maybe gives me some legitimacy. Basically, it was a question I asked all the historians I could lay my hands on. Why has nobody written a book on young Bengal? There has been so much written on 19th century Bengal that I know for a fact that historians in other parts of the country are sick to death of Bengal. I have actually had a historian of caste studies from Maharashtra say to me in a personal aside, Bengal, how much more of Bengal? And my response was, why don't you do the same for whichever region you're coming from? And I don't think enough has been done. I think more needs to be done, in fact. So, yes, in a field where the perception is that so much has been written, why have these people not been written about at all? There is no book on them. This is the first book on them that I know of. So, the answer was very interesting to me. The answer seemed to lie in two things: embarrassment and failure. So, this is a group who are perceived to have been a failure. They are perceived to have failed. What did they do? Nothing. What did they achieve? Nothing. Whatever they founded, whatever society they founded, and people don't even recognize that it's a political party, they had collapsed after 3 years. What was that? Nothing. So, on the other hand, Rammohun Roy is credited for the legislation against sati, which of course also could not have happened without Bentinck, as we know. But anyway, and then there is a leap from Rammohun Roy to Bidyasagar, who was again successful in getting a law passed allowing Hindu widows to remarry. So it is as if in between these two men, Rammohn Roy and Vidyasagar, nothing happened, which is definitely not true. Historians like Shumit Sarkar have written important, and he has written an important essay on Young Bengal called The Complexities of Young Bengal. It is actually the best piece of research done so far on the group. And he too makes this argument of failure. Why failure? Because they did not, in Shumit Sarkar's opinion, like the Russian intelligentsia, make that leap towards a revolutionary movement. Now, to not to decry a group of people because they didn't do whatever was done by the Russian revolutionaries seems to me not a fair assessment. So failure and embarrassment. Why? Because this was a group that spoke in English, wrote in English, as we've already discussed, hard drinking, went against all sorts of orthodoxies, went against custom, ritual, and also and ordinary parental expectation. They just went against all of that. How do you defend a group like that who seems who seem very embarrassing in many ways? What do you do? How do you defend them? Seem to be a problem. I can understand the problem though, Dinyar, because really the material was not there to be retrieved in India. I had to do it over a period of 10 years, sitting whenever I could at the British Library because the materials are not there in India. This period, the materials are not there in India. The two volumes that Gautam Chattopadhyay brought out were also retrieved from the British Library. So this work needs to be done outside of India. And that is difficult, and especially for that generation, and difficult. Difficult still, even now, today, but at least still possible nowadays with grants, with fellowships, with a short stint you take up somewhere and then you quickly and feverishly do as much of the work as you can at the British Library. That is how it was done. That's how I did it. But they hadn't seen these materials, in all fairness. So they couldn't make that argument on their behalf in any case. So this is the reason for them being forgotten, because the archive was not here also to be retrieved, but also the will was not there. That I can also see with some degree of clarity, that there was no desire to retrieve. There was a sense of their failure. What did they do? They didn't do anything at all. So these two premises combined to create both the derision and the forgettability of this group. Yeah.
Rosinka, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today and showing us that Young Bengal was much more than, as you said, beer drinking and beef eating, and that in actuality it had a humongous impact on not just the trajectory of Bengal itself, but India at large through the different political ideas that it propagated. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dinyar.